Welcome to the world of Dreamside Traveler. Here, beneath the soothing sound of gentle rain, we journey through time and space, uncovering the mysteries of the past and diving into the most captivating pages of human history. This place is created for those who love exploring the world in the quiet of evening, for those who value peace while yearning to discover something new before sleep. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please give this video a like. It helps other people find our stories. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers in our club of nighttime history lovers. And the Dreamside Traveler channel will become your faithful guide to sleep. We're constantly adding new stories for your peaceful evenings. And if you have ideas about which historical topics interest you, or simply want to share your thoughts, leave comments below the video. I'm genuinely curious to know what inspires you. Now close your eyes. Feel this gentle rain outside your window. Allow yourself to relax. Our journey begins right now. The day after the fight, when the dust had settled and the arena was empty, the gladiators faced a new reality. For some, the battle was a memory, a moment in time marked by blood and sweat. But for many, it was the beginning of a new chapter in a life bound by violence, survival, and uncertainty. Despite the overwhelming brutality they had just endured, the question of what came next was often more daunting than the fight itself. In the aftermath of the fight, survival became the gladiators' primary focus. The reality of life as a gladiator meant that every fight could be their last, but it also meant that survival after a battle was no guarantee. Many gladiators were left wounded, often with serious injuries that took months, if not years, to heal. A gladiator who had fought valiantly but suffered debilitating wounds might face the terrifying prospect of being discarded, left to die, or be sold into further servitude. There was no compassion or mercy in the aftermath of the battle. Gladiators who survived the arena had no right to rest or recover at their leisure. They were tools of entertainment, and once their usefulness was spent, they were discarded just like any other piece of equipment. For those who survived the fights, the question remained, what next? For the vast majority of gladiators, the options were limited and the future was uncertain. While it was true that some were given the opportunity to earn their freedom, the path to liberty was often long, difficult, and fraught with danger. Many gladiators, after winning several bouts or showing exceptional prowess in the arena, were granted the rudes, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom. This was a significant honor. A gladiator who had earned the rudes was seen as someone who had fought bravely, entertained the crowds, and was now freed from the brutal life of a gladiator. However, this freedom did not always mean an escape from the violence that defined their lives. For some gladiators, the transition from combatant to free man was not as simple as it seemed. They had been so deeply conditioned by their time in the arena that the thought of freedom was almost foreign to them. The idea of a peaceful life outside the arena was often inconceivable. The gladiatorial system had dehumanized them to such an extent that many felt they no longer belonged in the outside world. They had become creatures of the arena, fighters, killers and survivors, and that identity was not easily cast aside. One famous example of a gladiator who struggled with this transition is Flamma, a renowned gladiator who fought in the Colosseum. Flamma fought in a staggering 32 matches and became famous for his ability to endure incredible pain and continue fighting. Despite his remarkable success in the arena, Flamma was awarded the Rudy's freedom, but he chose to continue fighting. His choice was not one of greed or desire for glory, but one of necessity. Flamma had become so mentally and emotionally bound to the arena that the idea of leaving it was unsettling. His identity had been shaped by the violence of the Colosseum, and when faced with the opportunity to leave, he found himself unable to do so. He returned to the arena, choosing to fight once more. His story highlights the psychological toll of the gladiatorial system. The fact that freedom for many was not truly freedom at all, but rather the removal of a familiar, albeit brutal, existence. In many cases, gladiators who earned their freedom found themselves isolated. They were disconnected from society, unable to reintegrate into a world that had moved on without them. The scars, both physical and emotional, that they carried were not easily forgotten. For some, the violence of the arena had become so ingrained in their being that they could not adapt to a life without the constant rush of adrenaline that came with fighting for survival. Others, like Spartacus, chose to rebel against the system altogether. Spartacus, who is best known for leading the largest slave revolt in Roman history, was once a gladiator, and his decision to fight for his freedom was a direct result of the oppressive system in which he had been forced to participate. His rebellion was, in many ways, a response to the psychological trauma that gladiators experienced, an attempt to break free from the system that had reduced them to mere tools of death. But for the vast majority of gladiators, the choice to continue fighting or to leave the arena was never theirs to make. Gladiators were often treated as property, their value determined solely by their ability to entertain and fight. After a particularly brutal battle, some might be put out of action for weeks, even months, until they were fit to fight again. This was the grim reality for many gladiators, who faced not only the physical dangers of the arena, but the constant threat of disposability. The Lanistae, the owners and trainers of the gladiators, saw them as investments, assets that were valuable as long as they could perform. But once their fighting abilities diminished, they were discarded. Despite the harshness of the system, there were some glimmers of hope for gladiators after their careers in the arena. For a few lucky ones, the fame they earned from their performances allowed them to achieve wealth and status. Some gladiators used their renown to build careers outside of combat, becoming trainers or managers of other gladiators. They might even become celebrities in their own right, with fans and admirers who followed their every move. But these cases were rare, and most gladiators found their lives after the arena to be just as brutal and uncertain as their lives during their training and battles. For others, the end of their gladiatorial career often meant returning to a life of servitude. Even if they had earned their freedom, many gladiators returned to menial labor, or were sold back into the system. Gladiators who had fought for glory or for entertainment often found their skills irrelevant once they left the arena. The transition from fighter to civilian was rarely seamless, and many gladiators who survived the arena were lost, unable to find peace, unable to adjust to a world that no longer valued them as warriors. After a gladiator left the arena, the world they returned to was often unrecognizable. The life of a gladiator was one of extreme violence and emotional isolation, and adjusting to life outside the arena was a monumental challenge. For many, the freedom they so desperately fought for was not the escape they had imagined. Freedom was an idea they had longed for in the midst of the brutal conditions of the gladiatorial schools, but it came with a weight they were ill-prepared for. For those who had won their freedom and chose not to return to the arena, the future was uncertain. Some gladiators became trainers or managers, passing on their skills to the next generation of fighters. These individuals remained tied to the gladiatorial system, albeit in a different capacity. The life of a trainer or a manager was not without its challenges, but it offered a modicum of stability and a way to stay connected to the world they had come from. However, even in these positions, they remained in a world of violence and competition, constantly surrounded by the very system that had shaped them. Training other gladiators became a way for some to continue earning a living. Their status as experienced fighters gave them respect and authority, but the emotional toll of having been a gladiator could make the work difficult. Training the next generation meant not only teaching combat techniques, but also imposing the same harsh discipline that had been inflicted on them. The trainers often found themselves playing the role of both mentor and disciplinarian, shaping fighters into the same ruthless warriors they had once been. This could be both a source of power and psychological conflict. The very system that had caused them so much trauma now relied on them to perpetuate it. The emotional struggle faced by former gladiators often came with a deep sense of loneliness and disillusionment. For many, the arena had been a place of identity. It was where they found recognition, where they mattered. Outside of the arena, however, they were forgotten by most. In the eyes of Roman society, they were still considered inferior, mere slaves or ex-slaves. The transition from a celebrated fighter to an anonymous civilian was difficult, and the emotional scars of gladiatorial combat often lingered for years. The gladiators who had once been cheered by thousands now had to navigate a world that no longer offered them the attention or respect they had once received. One of the few examples of a gladiator who found true success after the arena was Commodus, the Roman emperor who had once fought as a gladiator. His story, however, is an anomaly. Most gladiators who gained fame did so only within the confines of the Colosseum. Commodus, who began his reign in the late 2nd century AD, used his gladiatorial experiences to build his own public persona. He participated in the arena, fought in staged battles, and portrayed himself as a heroic gladiator in the eyes of the people. His reign, however, was marked by increasing tyranny and megalomania, and his actions in the arena were seen as part of his larger need for control and public admiration. Commodus' use of gladiatorial combat as a political tool illustrates how some gladiators were able to transition from combat to fame and power. However, most gladiators did not have the luxury of a royal or political platform to build their lives upon. For the average gladiator, the end of their career often meant an existential crisis. With the loss of their role as fighters, many were forced to contend with their trauma and struggles to find a new purpose. Some went into manual labor, returning to jobs that were just as physically demanding, but without the recognition or status they once held. These gladiators often found that the skills they had honed for the arena were irrelevant in the civilian world. Their strength, speed, and agility were still present, but their place in the empire had been usurped by a new generation of fighters. However, there were instances where former gladiators found alternative forms of recognition. Some became prominent figures in the world of entertainment, transitioning from fighters to actors or performers. These gladiators used their experience and fame from the arena to capitalize on the public's fascination with violence and spectacle. Gladiatorial games had made them famous, and their post-arena careers allowed them to continue to be in the public eye. These individuals still remained part of the gladiatorial world, even if they no longer fought. Their celebrity status gave them the opportunity to find some semblance of purpose and stability, but it was often a hollow existence. Yet, for most gladiators, even those who were freed or who achieved some level of fame, the psychological toll of the arena was immense. Many former gladiators struggled with PTSD, living with the haunting memories of their fights and the violence they had been forced to commit. The mental scars of their experiences, the trauma of knowing that their lives had been expendable to the Roman Empire, haunted them long after their careers ended. Gladiators who survived the arena were not just survivors of physical wounds. They were survivors of psychological wounds, often scarred by the constant exposure to death and brutality. Even those who lived long lives outside the arena could not escape the shadow of the games. There were also gladiators who never left the world of combat, who continued to fight after their freedom had been earned or after their careers in the arena ended. Some returned to recruitment roles, seeking out other fighters for new games or serving as leaders in military campaigns. They had become warriors in every sense of the word, their skills never fully leaving them. Others took up roles as mercenaries or fighters in various wars. Gladiators who had honed their combat abilities in the arena were highly sought after as soldiers for private armies, or by wealthy Roman patrons who needed strong fighters for personal defense or for battles abroad. However, for many gladiators, the life after the arena was filled with regret. The sense of freedom they had once hoped for, the life they imagined they could lead once they left the games, often never materialized. Many gladiators found that they could never fully escape the violence of their past, and that the psychological scars they had accumulated were too deep to be healed by freedom or by new careers. The arena had left a permanent mark on them, both physically and mentally. and there was no way to fully return to a world that no longer had a place for them. As time passed, many gladiators who had earned their freedom or gained fame in the arena faced an ongoing internal struggle. They were free from the arena physically, but emotionally and psychologically, they remained tied to the violence they had lived through. The memories of the battle, the fear of death, the crowds roaring in approval or condemnation, these were never far from their minds. The trauma of the arena lingered like a shadow over their every step, making it difficult for many to find peace. For some former gladiators, the brutal system they had once been a part of had left a deep scar that they could not escape. Those who had fought for years, those who had killed or witnessed countless deaths, often had trouble adjusting to a peaceful life. Gladiators like Tetrates, a famous gladiator known for his multiple victories, struggled with the emotional cost of the violence they had been forced to participate in. While Tetrates had earned his freedom and could have lived a quiet life, the weight of his past would never let him go. He turned to drinking and brawling, unable to reconcile his past with his present. The intense mental strain left him in a perpetual state of conflict, caught between the man he had once been and the man he had become. Many gladiators struggled with this duality. They could never escape their past. For those who did not find psychological peace or integration back into civilian life, the arena became a haunting reminder of everything they had lost. The psychological cost of gladiatorial combat was not merely about physical survival, but about losing oneself in the process. Former gladiators who had once been revered for their bravery and skill now found themselves marginalized. No longer warriors, but men estranged from the world they had once known. The hope of finding a new life or purpose outside the arena seemed almost unattainable for many. However, some gladiators found that their status as fighters allowed them to continue building careers, albeit in different forms. A few gladiators turned to training other fighters. As respected veterans, they were in demand to prepare the next generation of gladiators for the arena. These men had an invaluable wealth of knowledge and experience, both in physical combat and in the mental preparation required for the arena. Training other gladiators allowed them to stay connected to their former lives while also providing them with a steady source of income. Yet even here, the emotional toll was heavy. Many of these trainers, like Bedtime, who ran one of the most infamous ludus in Rome, continued to perpetuate the cycle of violence, training young men to fight and die, all while bearing the psychological burden of knowing what it truly meant to be a gladiator. For others, the life after the arena was an attempt to break free from the system. They found themselves in different parts of the Roman Empire, searching for new opportunities and trying to find purpose. Marcus Attilius, for example, a gladiator who had survived many battles, became involved in public administration after his gladiatorial career ended. His status as a former gladiator allowed him to rise to prominence. But even this new life was not without its struggles. Though he managed to escape the life of fighting, the psychological scars remained, and he was never fully able to escape the world that had shaped him. The mental toll of his past life lingered in his thoughts and actions, leaving him with a sense of unease and dissatisfaction. Some gladiators turned to military service, joining the Roman legions or mercenary forces, where their combat experience made them highly valuable. The Roman army had long been a place where men of diverse backgrounds could rise through the ranks if they showed dedication and bravery in battle. For gladiators, the military offered both a new sense of identity and a chance to continue using their combat skills. However, even in the military, they faced psychological challenges. Gladiators who had fought in the arena often found themselves questioning the moral justification for the violence they had committed. They had spent years learning to kill for the entertainment of others, and now they were asked to kill for the empire. The transition from gladiator to soldier was not always an easy one, and many gladiators struggled with the same internal conflict, the same loss of identity that had plagued them in the arena. But despite the opportunities that sometimes existed, life after the arena was rarely as fulfilling as the gladiators had hoped. The stigma of being a former gladiator followed them, often making it difficult to form meaningful relationships or secure stable employment. Even those who were lucky enough to find work outside of combat had to face the reality that the gladiatorial system had left them as outcasts in Roman society. In the eyes of many, they were still seen as property, as tools of violence. They had been trained to kill, to entertain, and when their usefulness was over, society had little to offer them. Many former gladiators, no matter how successful or well-respected, continued to carry the scars of the arena. The emotional burden of their experiences could never fully be healed. The violence they had witnessed and participated in had changed them, shaped them in ways that were impossible to erase. Even those who found new careers or stability were often haunted by the memory of the arena, by the sounds of swords clashing, by the faces of the men they had killed, or the brutal fights they had endured. The idea of freedom for a gladiator was thus more complex than it appeared. While it was true that some men escaped the brutal world of the arena, most of them found themselves in a world that could never fully accept them. Their lives, their identities, had been so defined by their time as gladiators that their futures were irrevocably tied to that violent world. They were never truly free, and for those who found themselves unable to adapt, there was always the lingering threat of being forgotten, lost to the system that had once made them famous, but ultimately discarded them as they grew older or less useful. In the end, the question of what came after the arena was always one of survival, both physical and psychological. Gladiators who managed to outlive the arena often found that the scars they carried, whether physical or mental, were the true challenges they had to face. They had fought for their lives, for their freedom, but in the end, what they had won was a new kind of battle, one that was far more difficult and, in many ways, more terrifying than any fight they had faced in the Colosseum. For the gladiators who survived the arena and somehow found a way to continue their lives, the struggle was never truly over. While their bodies might have healed from the wounds of countless battles, the psychological scars remained, sometimes even more painful than the physical ones. The question of what a gladiator could do after his time in the arena was a haunting one. Many former gladiators could not reconcile their brutal past with the demands of the world outside the arena. The transition was complicated by the fact that gladiators, who had once been revered and feared as warriors, were now often treated as nothing more than outcasts in a society that did not fully accept them. Many former gladiators found themselves alone, isolated from the very world they had once fought to protect. Their lives, now marked by the violence and trauma of the arena, left them disconnected from normal society. Freedom often came at a price. While they might have gained the right to live as free men, they lost the sense of purpose that the gladiatorial life had once provided. The emotional and mental toll was profound, and it was something that many struggled to live with. One particular example is the story of Eppius, a gladiator who won his freedom after many years of fighting. Eppius had fought in multiple arenas, gaining a reputation for his brutal efficiency and strength. When he was granted the rudes and officially freed, he was celebrated for his success. Yet, despite being free, Eppius found it nearly impossible to live outside of the gladiatorial world. He struggled to adjust to civilian life and found that the only thing he knew how to do was fight. Unable to reintegrate into society, he eventually chose to return to the arena. His return was not out of necessity. It was because the only identity he had ever known was that of a gladiator, and he could not reconcile his past with the present. Eppius, like many gladiators, found that freedom was not a simple release from captivity. It was a psychological trap that left him unable to escape the life of violence and bloodshed that had shaped him. Some gladiators, after being freed, found themselves relegated to menial labor. Having spent their lives training for combat, their skills had no place in a peaceful society. They were not accepted as regular citizens and often had to rebuild their lives from the ground up. For those who survived the arena, life outside the gladiatorial schools often meant returning to the kinds of labor they had left behind before they were captured. This reality was not an easy one to accept. They had been trained for violence, not for farming, trade, or any other regular occupation. Their identities had been shaped by the expectation of violence, and this dissonance between their former roles and their current lives was difficult to bridge. Some gladiators did find a way to use their fame and reputation to carve out new careers for themselves, though these opportunities were rare. A few gladiators used their experiences to become performers or actors, capitalizing on the public's fascination with violence and combat. The gladiatorial games had made them famous, and for a few, the recognition and status they had earned as fighters gave them an opportunity to build careers in other forms of entertainment. These former gladiators became the stars of public spectacles, showcasing their combat prowess in mock battles or using their fame to gain wealth. But for many of these men, the transition from fighter to performer was just another way to stay connected to the gladiatorial world they could not escape. On the other hand, some gladiators took the military route. The Roman army, always in need of skilled soldiers, often recruited former gladiators as mercenaries. The skills they had honed in the arena, strength, endurance, and combat proficiency, made them valuable assets to the legions. For these gladiators, military service was often a way to escape their past while continuing to use the skills that had defined their lives. While many found stability and purpose in the military, the psychological strain of having lived as a gladiator often continued to haunt them. They had been conditioned to fight and kill, and now they were asked to do the same in the service of the Roman Empire. The emotional toll of constantly living with violence was profound, and many gladiators found themselves struggling with the same internal conflict in the military as they had in the arena. For those gladiators who never returned to the arena, and who did not find their way into military service or mercenary work, the life that awaited them was often one of quiet desperation. Freed gladiators, who did not have the support of a patron or the privilege of wealth, found themselves on the fringes of Roman society. They were seen as former slaves. No matter their victories in the arena, no matter the blood they had spilled for the amusement of the public, they were still considered second-class citizens. They often lived in poverty and had little chance of improving their circumstances. Many died young, either from the long-term effects of injuries sustained in the arena from disease, or from their inability to reintegrate into society. There were some, however, who found peace in unexpected places. A few former gladiators formed tight-knit communities, finding solace in each other's company and using their shared experiences to rebuild their lives. They created networks of support, helping each other navigate the difficulties of life after the arena. These former gladiators found a sense of brotherhood that they had not experienced during their time in the games, where every gladiator was a competitor and every battle a fight for survival. In these communities, gladiators who had once been rivals found strength in solidarity, offering each other the mental and emotional support they had lacked for so long. However, even these communities did not provide a perfect escape. The brutal reality of gladiatorial life left deep emotional and psychological scars that could never truly be healed. Some former gladiators were left with a sense of alienation, unable to fully connect with the outside world or integrate into normal society. The psychological trauma of having been trained to kill for sport, to entertain a bloodthirsty public, stayed with them for the rest of their lives. No matter how much time had passed, the memories of the arena, the blood, the violence, and the fear remained burned into their minds. The fate of the gladiators was often dictated not by their actions, but by the system. They were trapped in a system that used them, broke them, and then discarded them when they were no longer needed. Their survival depended on their ability to adapt, to become killing machines, to forget their humanity in order to survive. Yet, even if they won their freedom or managed to find a career outside the arena, they were never truly free. The psychological cost of their experiences could never be paid in full, and the life they had lived left its marks in ways that no time, no job, no community could erase. As time wore on, the lives of former gladiators became a reflection of the brutal, unforgiving world that had shaped them. For many, the psychological scars of their past experiences never fully healed. The process of becoming a gladiator, the physical training, the conditioning, and the battles in the arena had irrevocably altered their minds. These men had been molded by violence and combat, and even after they left the arena, they carried the emotional and mental weight of that transformation. Some former gladiators did manage to find peace or purpose, but for many, their freedom from the arena did not translate into a life free from the mental and emotional chains that had bound them for so long. Even those who managed to build careers as trainers, soldiers, or performers often found themselves still living in the shadow of their past. They were haunted by the memories of the arena, of the men they had fought alongside, and the countless lives they had taken. The emotional cost of their experiences was not something that could be easily escaped. No matter how many victories they had won or how much fame they had gained, the process of detaching from their humanity, of being trained to kill and entertain, had left deep psychological scars that affected their ability to form new identities or integrate into civilian life. Gladiators had spent so much time defining themselves through their ability to fight and survive that, once free, they often had no other sense of self. In some cases, the trauma from the arena manifested in substance abuse or violent outbursts. The aggression they had learned in the arena, the need to fight in order to survive, was difficult to suppress. The memories of the intense physical and mental pain, the constant fear of death, and the sheer brutality of the games stayed with them long after they left the arena. For some, this led to a sense of emotional numbness, a detachment from society, and a longing for the violence they had known. It was a cycle that many gladiators could not escape. The more they tried to distance themselves from their past, the more they were pulled back into it, mentally and emotionally. One of the most poignant examples of this psychological struggle comes from the story of Marius, a gladiator who fought for years before earning his freedom. Marius had been celebrated as a skilled fighter, and he earned the rudies after a particularly successful run in the arena. Yet once freed, he found it nearly impossible to adjust to life outside of the gladiatorial world. The pain he had endured in the arena, both physical and emotional, followed him wherever he went. The memories of his battles, of the men he had fought beside and killed, haunted him. He attempted to live a quiet life, but he found himself constantly drawn back to the violence he had left behind. Marius struggled with his identity, unable to escape the grip of the arena and the mental conditioning that had made him the fighter he had become. Eventually, he turned to the life of a mercenary, seeking out new battles in foreign lands where he could continue to fight. For Marius, the arena had become more than just a place of survival. It had become his identity, and no matter how hard he tried to escape it, he found himself unable to live without the rush of battle. This story of Marius was not unique. Many gladiators who survived the arena and earned their freedom struggled with the same challenges. Disorientation, mental instability, and the overwhelming pressure of reintegrating into a society that had never fully accepted them. The trauma they had endured in the arena became part of them, a part that no amount of wealth, fame, or even freedom could erase. The arena had shaped them, and it had shaped them in ways that were both mental and emotional, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. Even gladiators who were fortunate enough to find purpose outside the arena often did so in environments that were still connected to the world of violence. Those who became soldiers or mercenaries continued to fight, but this time for a different cause: the empire's expansion, private armies, or defending the wealthy elite. Though they were no longer part of the gladiatorial games, they found themselves back in the world of combat and bloodshed. The training they had undergone in the ludus had prepared them well for this. But the mental toll of fighting for the amusement of others was never truly shaken off. Some gladiators who made it out of the arena found success as celebrity figures in the Roman world, where the fascination with gladiators remained strong. These men were often invited to perform in public events, or used as symbols of strength in the empire. Their fame, which had been gained through blood and combat, allowed them to build new careers as entertainers or public figures. These roles still tied them to the public's thirst for violence and spectacle, but it also gave them some semblance of control over their lives. However, even those who achieved fame often felt trapped in the persona of the gladiator. They were valued for their ability to kill and fight, but this recognition was a shallow one. It was rooted in the spectacle of death, not the substance of their character. Despite these options, the lives of former gladiators remained filled with uncertainty and hardship. The mental conditioning they had undergone to survive in the arena, the fear, the pain, the violence, made it difficult for them to find peace. The gladiators who were lucky enough to escape the games, to live long enough to earn their freedom or transition into new careers, often found themselves looking back at their past with a sense of loss. They had been transformed into something they could no longer recognize. Their bodies were marked by the scars of battle, and their minds were filled with the memories of death and violence. They were survivors, but they were survivors of a system that had stripped them of everything that made them human. The question that remained for these gladiators was whether they could ever truly live again. The answer, for most, was no. They had been shaped by the arena, and the mental scars they carried would never fade. The gladiatorial system had taught them to fight, to kill, and to survive at all costs. But when the arena was no longer their home, they were left with nothing but the memories of their battles, and the haunting question of whether they would ever find peace. The atmosphere in the Roman amphitheater was thick with anticipation, a charged, almost electric energy that filled the air as the crowd waited for the next battle to begin. The gladiators stood in the sand, muscles tense, weapons at the ready. Eyes focused on the fight that would either lead to their survival or to their violent death. In the early days of the Roman Empire, gladiatorial combat had been a spectacle designed to entertain the masses. But as the games evolved, they became something much darker, a twisted reflection of Roman values, political power, and the brutal nature of the society itself. The concept of death on the arena was not a random occurrence, nor was it simply an unfortunate outcome of a fight. It was often a deliberate act, a sacrifice intended to entertain, to honor the gods, or even to serve political and social agendas. Gladiatorial combat was not just about skill and strength. It was also about the manipulation of power, the demonstration of the might of Rome, and the control of the masses. For the gladiators, death in the arena was something they had to face as a possible, even likely, outcome of their participation in this grim spectacle. The final fight, the battle that would determine whether a gladiator lived or died, was often the most intense and brutal. These fights were not simply about the combatants' physical abilities. They were a test of endurance, willpower, and morality. Gladiators were trained not only to fight, but also to accept the possibility of their own death, to come to terms with the idea that their lives were ultimately expendable in the eyes of those who controlled the arena. In many cases, gladiators were forced to fight to the death. However, the final decision was not always up to them. The editor, the person overseeing the games, often had the final say on whether a defeated gladiator would be spared or killed. This decision was influenced by a number of factors, most notably the crowd's reaction. The power of the Roman public was immense, and their bloodlust played a significant role in determining the fate of a gladiator. If the crowd called for death, then death would come swiftly, usually through a final blow from the victorious gladiator. If, however, the crowd showed mercy or favored the defeated gladiator's bravery, there was a chance that he would be allowed to live. The decision was symbolized by the famous thumb gesture, pollice versa, which, contrary to popular belief, did not mean thumbs down for death. In fact, it was often the thumb turned up that signified death, while the thumb turned sideways or inward was a call for mercy. The moral implications of gladiatorial death were profound, especially considering the Roman Empire's complex relationship with life, death, and entertainment. On the surface, the games were a celebration of Roman might, a display of how powerful the empire had become, and how it could command the lives of its people, particularly its slaves and prisoners of war. Gladiators were often prisoners, slaves, or criminals, and their lives held little value outside of the arena. But the games also served a darker function. They were a tool of control. The spectacle of death on display for the masses helped reinforce the power of the ruling elite. It demonstrated that the emperor and the elite could not only control the lives of the gladiators, but could also control the lives of the common people by manipulating their desire for violence and spectacle. Gladiatorial combat, with its brutal finality, was a reflection of the empire's will to dominate, not just in battle, but in society. At the same time, the idea of sacrifice played a key role in the gladiatorial games. In many cases, a gladiator's death was seen as an offering to the gods, a ritualistic act meant to ensure victory in battle, prosperity for the empire, or favor from the gods. The death of a gladiator was sometimes viewed as an act of devotion, a way of appeasing divine forces in exchange for success on the battlefield or in the political arena. These acts of death were often seen as noble sacrifices, even as they represented the brutal exploitation of the gladiators themselves. One famous historical example of this comes from the reign of Emperor Commodus, who not only participated in gladiatorial combat, but also used his involvement in the arena as a way to manipulate public perception and assert his power. Commodus, as an emperor, had the power to decide life and death in the arena. He fought in many staged battles, where the outcome was often predetermined, yet his participation was designed to enhance his image as a ruler who was willing to fight alongside his soldiers and the people. His involvement in these blood-soaked spectacles served to reinforce his authority and to remind the citizens of Rome that the emperor, like the gladiators, could face death. But his ability to survive was a symbol of his divinity and power. Commodus' battles were more than just entertainment. They were part of a larger political strategy aimed at maintaining control over the empire through the exploitation of violence. However, not all gladiators who fought to the death did so for political reasons. For many, the fight was simply a matter of survival, an effort to live another day. One such example is the story of Spartacus, the famous gladiator who led a rebellion against the Roman Republic. Spartacus, a gladiator by training and a slave by circumstance, fought not for the glory of the arena, but for his freedom, and for the freedom of those like him. His rebellion was fueled by the desire to break free from the brutal world of gladiatorial combat, and the system that reduced men to nothing more than tools of death. His story is a tragic one, a tale of bravery, resistance, and ultimate sacrifice. Spartacus and his army of escaped gladiators fought for years, but in the end, their efforts were crushed by the might of Rome, and their deaths served as a grim reminder of the empire's power. Despite the brutality and bloodshed that defined the gladiatorial games, there were moments when gladiators were able to defy their roles as tools of death. Some gladiators, like Flamma, who earned the rudies after many successful battles, chose not to die in the arena. They were given the opportunity to leave the games and return to civilian life, but this choice was not always one of freedom. Flamma, who had fought in over 30 battles, chose to remain in the arena even after being offered freedom. His decision to continue fighting after earning his freedom highlights the mental conditioning that gladiators underwent. For many, the arena had become a part of their identity. Fighting was all they knew, and the prospect of freedom often seemed too daunting to consider. The psychological weight of being a gladiator, of becoming a living weapon, was so great that some chose to stay in the arena despite the possibility of death. As the deadly spectacle of gladiatorial combat continued to captivate Roman society, the concept of death in the arena evolved from a mere display of violence into a symbolic event. The final moments in the arena, where life and death were decided, were not simply an outcome of physical combat, but a reflection of the values, power, and control that the Roman Empire sought to project. The fate of a gladiator was often intertwined with much larger societal and political issues. the death of a gladiator was not always just the end of an individual's life. It was a political statement, a reflection of Roman power, and at times, a moral lesson for the citizens of Rome. One of the most interesting and disturbing aspects of gladiatorial death was the role that the crowd played in determining a gladiator's fate. The Roman people were not passive spectators. They had the power to decide whether a gladiator would live or die. This power was not simply symbolic. The crowd's shouts, chants, and gestures could seal a gladiator's fate, for better or worse. A defeated gladiator might appeal to the crowd for mercy, hoping that the emperor or the editor would spare his life if the people demanded it. The decision of whether to spare a gladiator or end his life often depended on the mood of the crowd. The emperor or the official in charge of the games, known as the editor, had the ultimate say in a gladiator's fate. But their decision was often influenced by the popular will. If the crowd demanded death, it was not uncommon for the editor to comply, even if the gladiator had fought bravely. The role of the crowd was central to the gladiatorial system, and the decision to spare or execute a gladiator was not always based on the value of the fight, but on how well the gladiator had pleased the masses. The psychology of the crowd is key to understanding the violence of the arena. The Romans had a deeply ingrained culture of entertainment and bloodshed, and the gladiatorial games provided them with a venue to satisfy their need for spectacle. The crowd's behavior was driven by a thirst for violence, and they demanded not only skill, but also drama. The more thrilling and violent the fight, the more likely the gladiator was to be spared. But if the fight was perceived as disappointing or lacking in excitement, the crowd's favor could turn quickly. This system created a constant pressure for gladiators to perform at their best. But it also created an environment where death could be meted out at the whim of the audience. The brutal realities of gladiatorial combat were compounded by the moral and philosophical dilemmas that surrounded the practice. Gladiators, for the most part, were slaves or prisoners of war, and they were treated as property rather than as individuals. Their lives were valued only in relation to their ability to entertain and fight. However, the public's relationship to these gladiators was more complicated. On the one hand, they were entertainment, serving as a distraction from the troubles of daily life, and their deaths served to reinforce Roman ideals of courage, strength, and valor. On the other hand, the death of a gladiator in the arena posed questions about the morality of using human life as entertainment. The philosophers of Rome, particularly the Stoics, criticized the gladiatorial games for their cruelty and their indifference to the value of life. Seneca, one of Rome's greatest Stoic philosophers, wrote extensively about the moral consequences of gladiatorial combat. In his letters and essays, Seneca condemned the games as a reflection of Rome's moral decay. He argued that the public's insatiable appetite for violence was a dangerous aspect of Roman society, one that corrupted the soul and undermined true Roman virtue. He pointed out that the cheering of the crowd for bloodshed and death was a symptom of a society that had lost its way, where entertainment had become more important than the sanctity of human life. Yet despite the moral criticisms, gladiatorial games were an essential part of Roman culture. The games symbolized the power of the emperor and the strength of Rome itself. They were a way for the emperor to show the people that he had the power to control life and death, to bring spectacle and chaos to the people's lives, while maintaining an iron grip on order and authority. The gladiators, who were often viewed as expendable tools, served the dual purpose of entertaining the masses, while simultaneously reinforcing the political authority of the ruling elite. The fact that the games were often staged in the Colosseum, the largest and most impressive arena in Rome, only emphasized the spectacle's connection to Roman power. The death of a gladiator, then, was more than just a tragic end to an individual's life. It was an event, a political tool, and a social commentary. It reminded the people of Rome of their emperor's power, of their own vulnerability, and of the fragility of life itself. In the world of the gladiators, death was not only inevitable, it was part of the very fabric of Roman identity and society. One of the most infamous instances of a gladiator's death, and the moral questions surrounding it, comes from the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius, notorious for his cruelty and paranoia, once ordered a series of gladiatorial games that lasted for several days. During these games, he decided that the death toll would be much higher than usual. The gladiators who survived these initial bouts were forced to continue fighting, with the emperor personally deciding their fate. This callous disregard for life reflected the ruthlessness of the emperor's rule, and the games became a symbol of Roman decadence. During these games, Tiberius reportedly took pleasure in watching the death of gladiators who had performed well in previous matches. He found entertainment not in the battles themselves, but in the suffering and death of those who had become symbols of Roman strength. The emperor's indifference to life only emphasized the larger social reality. Gladiators were not men. They were tools, commodities, and ultimately, sacrifices to the empire's power and prestige. As the games continued to evolve, the question of death in the arena became more intertwined with the political needs of the Roman elite. Gladiatorial contests were no longer just entertainment. They were a means of maintaining control over the people, asserting the power of the emperor, and reinforcing the dominance of Roman authority. Gladiators, the expendable men who fought and died for the entertainment of the masses, became symbols not just of the brutality of the empire, but of its imperial power. This political control through violence was not lost on those in power. The emperor could use the games to boost his popularity and legitimize his rule. If a gladiator fought well and survived, it reflected well on the emperor's ability to bring strength and order to the empire. If a gladiator died spectacularly, it symbolized the emperor's absolute power over life and death. Every decision, whether to spare a gladiator's life or to grant them a brutal death, was a calculated one, a decision made with an eye to political gain. Gladiators' lives were disposable in the eyes of the elite, but their deaths were strategic and could be used to sway public opinion. to inspire fear or admiration, or to maintain the emperor's godlike image. This morality was further complicated by the fact that many of the gladiators who entered the arena did so willingly, despite the overwhelming risk of death. Some, particularly voluntary gladiators, chose to fight in the arena for reasons that were more personal than simply survival. These men, often desperate for money or fame, saw the arena as their best chance for glory. Others, however, were slaves or prisoners of war, forced into a life where death was a constant threat. These gladiators were often viewed as the lowest in Roman society, their lives cheapened by their status as commodities, their value determined only by how well they fought. For the Roman elite, this disposable nature of the gladiators made it easier to justify their deaths in the arena. The games were meant to reinforce Roman power, to remind the people of the emperor's absolute authority. In Roman eyes, the life of a gladiator was worth little compared to the need for public spectacle. The higher the number of gladiators who fought and died in a single event, the greater the emperor's reputation as a ruler who could command life and death at will. The death toll was not just a body count, it was a statement. The number of men who died on the sand was directly tied to the emperor's control over the empire. In addition to the political and moral dimensions, there were also religious elements to gladiatorial death. Sacrifice, in the Roman context, was not limited to animals. Human sacrifice had played a role in some religious ceremonies, and the gladiatorial games, with their bloodshed and violence, often had ritualistic undertones. The death of a gladiator could be seen as an offering to the gods, an act of appeasement that would ensure the prosperity of the empire or the emperor's military success. The idea that the arena was a place of sacrifice was reflected in how the games were viewed by the public. Some Romans saw the gladiators' deaths as noble, as men willing to offer up their lives in exchange for the good of the empire. The death of a gladiator, therefore, was often viewed not just as a violent end to a fighter's life, but as a sacred moment, a ritual performed in the presence of the gods. It was believed that the gods would watch the games, ensuring that the sacrifices made in the arena would lead to victory in battle or peace within the empire. The gladiator, in many ways, became a living sacrifice, someone who gave up their freedom and, in some cases, their life for the greater good of Rome. This religious aspect of the games reinforced their importance in Roman culture and society. Yet not all gladiators met their end in the arena with such ceremonial regard. For some, the gladiatorial games were a death sentence from the start. One of the most famous examples of a gladiator's brutal end comes from the story of Priscus and Verus, two gladiators who fought in a legendary match during the reign of Emperor Titus. According to historical sources, Priscus and Verus fought in a legendary combat where both men were evenly matched. The fight was long and brutal, and the crowd was on the edge of their seats, cheering for the victor. Eventually, both gladiators were so injured that they could no longer continue the fight. At that point, Emperor Titus decided to step in and offer a decision. He allowed the gladiators to make the final choice. Both Priscus and Verus, knowing that their lives were in the emperor's hands, chose to live. They both bowed to the crowd and requested mercy. Titus, impressed by their bravery, awarded both men the rudes, granting them their freedom. This moment was one of the rare instances where the gladiators were allowed to live after such a vicious battle. The fact that Titus, in this instance, spared their lives shows the power of the crowd and the ability of gladiators to earn mercy. But this was an exception rather than the rule. For most gladiators, there was no such choice. Their fate was determined by the whims of the emperor or the editor, and their lives were forfeit once they stepped into the arena. The spectacle of death was part of the game itself, a reflection of Rome's need for control and dominance. The death of gladiators, then, was not just a matter of personal tragedy or loss. It was a systematic process that served the interests of the Roman Empire. It was a reflection of Roman values, of their political system, and of the immense power that the emperor held over the lives of his people. For the gladiators, death was an inevitable part of their existence, and whether they lived or died often depended not on their skill or courage, but on the whims of those who watched them fight. The death of a gladiator in the arena was not only an individual tragedy, but also a complex reflection of Roman society's moral, political, and social fabric. It was a spectacle that intertwined the lives of the gladiators with the very identity of the empire, serving as a reminder of the power of the emperor, the whims of the masses, and the unyielding dominance of Roman law and custom. The fate of each gladiator, whether they lived or died, spoke volumes about the values of the empire and its relationship with violence, entertainment, and control. The gladiatorial death was often a final spectacle, designed to fulfill the Roman need for violence, but also to demonstrate the emperor's complete authority over life and death. Gladiators were not only fighters, but symbols of the Roman ability to control not just the bodies of slaves and criminals, but also the very act of life and death itself. The death of a gladiator was an act that transcended simple violence. It was an exhibition of power that reinforced the emperor's status as the ultimate ruler. The arena was a place where Roman society could see, up close and personal, the empire's unquestionable dominance. Beyond the immediate brutality of a gladiator's death, there was also a larger political purpose at work. The games and the bloodshed within the arena were used to reinforce the emperor's position by connecting his power to the blood spilled in the sand. In a world where emperors were constantly facing the challenge of maintaining control over a vast and diverse empire, the arena provided a perfect platform to assert their dominance. Gladiators, in their death and suffering, were mere pawns in this larger political game. Their fates were decided not by the strength of their weapons or skill, but by the whims of those who controlled the spectacle. Roman emperors, particularly during the height of the empire, recognized the power of public spectacle. The more violent and entertaining the games, the greater the emperor's power seemed. Even emperors who were unpopular or insecure would stage lavish games to curry favor with the people and demonstrate their strength. A death in the arena could provide an emperor with the opportunity to show mercy or punish an opponent, demonstrating both clemency and severity as tools to maintain control. The willingness to either spare or execute a gladiator based on the crowd's demands demonstrated the emperor's role as a godlike figure, holding the power to decide who would live or die. The gladiatorial games, in turn, reflected the imperial policy of making a spectacle of death. As the empire expanded, the use of gladiators became more frequent, and the types of combat varied. Some gladiators were forced to fight in one-on-one duels, while others faced a group of opponents, sometimes fighting animals or even executing condemned criminals in highly dramatic public events. The sheer diversity of battles, from the simplest sword fights to the most elaborate mock sea battles, was designed to please the crowds and to make a statement about the unquestioned supremacy of Roman authority. Despite the political and social reasons behind gladiatorial deaths, there were moments when gladiators themselves chose to defy their fate. Some refused to die, showing the world their strength in ways that transcended the typical image of a helpless victim. This act of rebellion, however, was rare and often led to even more brutal consequences. The death of a gladiator in rebellion became its own spectacle, a defiance of Roman authority, an act that challenged the very nature of the games. Gladiators who fought to the death for honor or revenge were rarely spared. Their deaths, when they did occur, were not just punishments. They were statements about the emperor's unassailable power. The audience at the games may have cheered for their bravery, but in the end, the arena's true purpose was to reinforce imperial authority and obedience. One of the most famous instances of such defiance came from Spartacus, the gladiator who led the greatest slave revolt in Roman history. Spartacus had been a gladiator, forced into the arena as a prisoner of war. But instead of accepting his fate as many gladiators did, he rebelled, leading an army of escaped gladiators and slaves in a fight for freedom. Spartacus' story was one of resilience and bravery. He fought not for the entertainment of the crowd, but for his survival and the survival of his comrades. His revolt lasted for several years, and while it eventually ended in failure, it marked one of the greatest acts of defiance against Roman power. Spartacus' death in battle, while tragic, was also a reminder that the games and the brutality of the arena had fostered an environment where men could rise above their oppressors, if only for a short time. In the final moments of a gladiator's life, when death was certain, the symbolism of the event was profound. Whether they fought for honor, survival, or freedom, the death of a gladiator in the arena represented the fragility of life and the extent to which Roman society was willing to turn human lives into mere tools of entertainment. In the blood-stained sands of the arena, gladiators' lives were taken with brutal efficiency, often without mercy, to please the crowd and further the political agendas of those in power. But in some rare cases, their final moments could reflect a moment of humanity, a moment of choice, a final plea for mercy, or a heroic last stand. These fleeting moments of dignity, however, did not last. In the end, Gladiators were but tools in the great machinery of Roman control. Their deaths another display of the empire's power to shape the fate of its subjects. For those who survived the games, the idea of death on the arena remained ever present in their minds. It wasn't just something that happened to others. It was something that could happen to anyone at any moment. Even after leaving the arena, the shadow of death loomed over the gladiators' life, constantly reminding them of the world they had once belonged to, a world where survival was not guaranteed. And death was always waiting in the wings, ready to claim its next victim. The final moments of a gladiator's life were often marked by the crowd's roar, the harsh judgment of the emperor, and the terrifying certainty of death. These gladiators had been trained, conditioned, and exploited for one purpose only: to fight until they could fight no more. In their last moments, whether they faced the sword of their opponent or the cold decision of the emperor, they were left with nothing but the knowledge that they were mere tools of entertainment. The spectacle of death was not only about their demise, but about reinforcing Roman ideals, values, and the immense power of the empire. For the emperor and the editor, the official overseeing the games, each decision to grant life or death carried significant weight. The emperor's role was not only to control the political order, but also to maintain his image as the ultimate ruler, capable of determining the fate of his subjects with a mere gesture or word. The moment when the gladiator was left on the sand, exhausted and wounded, symbolized not only the gladiator's submission to Rome's power, but also the ultimate demonstration of the emperor's control over life and death. The crowd's cries for blood were not just a display of their thirst for entertainment, but were woven into the very fabric of imperial authority. The system of death in the arena, the final blow administered to a defeated gladiator, represented the end of the gladiator's narrative, a story written in blood, sweat, and pain. Yet this finality was also a continuation of the ongoing narrative of the empire itself. Every gladiatorial contest, every life extinguished on the arena's sands, served a larger purpose. These deaths were not isolated. They were part of a grand spectacle designed to demonstrate the power, the grandeur, and the authority of the Roman Empire. The gladiators, though they had no power over their fate, symbolized the imperial will to control, to dominate, and to reign over life and death. Despite this, there were rare moments when the power of the gladiators themselves could challenge this predetermined fate. These rare instances often came when a gladiator refused to die. In moments of intense courage, certain gladiators would rise above the brutality of the arena, choosing to fight not for their own survival, but for honor and dignity. These moments stood in stark contrast to the usual expectation of gladiatorial death. They were the glimmers of humanity in a world built on violence and dehumanization. These men, though defeated in battle, became symbols of resistance, figures who, even in death, could inspire others with their courage and defiance. One of the most significant examples of this defiance occurred in the famous match between Flamma and Crixus. Both gladiators were seasoned warriors, known for their strength, courage, and the many battles they had fought. They were not just fighting for their survival, but for their honor. Crixus, who had been a leader in the slave rebellion, fought fiercely against the Roman system. Though he was eventually defeated, Crixus' fight was not about the outcome. It was about showing the empire that, even in the arena, a gladiator could stand for something more than just bloodshed. Crixus' fight represented the ultimate resistance to a system that saw him as little more than a tool for entertainment. The story of Flamma, who continued fighting even after being granted his freedom, speaks to the psychological toll of gladiatorial combat. His decision to keep fighting, despite the freedom that had been offered to him, shows how the system shaped the gladiators in ways that went beyond physical training. The idea of freedom was a foreign concept to Flamma, and the mental conditioning he had undergone in the ludus had altered his very sense of self. For him, the arena had become his identity. His survival depended not on his ability to escape it, but on his ability to embrace it. Even though he had earned his freedom, Flamma could not break free from the grip of the arena. His death, in many ways, symbolized the tragedy of the gladiator's existence, one that was shaped by violence and bloodshed, and one that could never truly escape the shadow of the arena. Despite these rare moments of defiance or resistance, the overwhelming reality for most gladiators was the brutal finality of death. The moral ambiguity of their existence was something that few could escape. Their lives were defined by the violence of the arena, their deaths by the demands of the crowd and the decisions of the emperor. The gladiators were trapped in a world where they had no agency, where their fates were sealed the moment they entered the ludus. The political significance of their deaths was a constant reminder of the empire's power that extended not just over the lands it conquered, but over the very lives of its subjects, even the lives of those who were meant to entertain. The most publicly celebrated deaths were those that provided the most spectacle, the most drama. These were the fights that ended in bloodshed, where the crowd watched eagerly for the final blow. Gladiators who died in such dramatic fashion became martyrs in the eyes of the crowd, symbols of sacrifice for the entertainment of the empire. Their death was no longer just a loss of life. It was a statement about the strength and dominance of Rome. It was an offering to the gods, an act of devotion to the empire. And yet, behind the spectacle, the gladiator's death was also a reflection of the emperor's power to decide who would live, who would die, and who would be remembered as a hero. As the gladiatorial games continued, the moral implications of these deaths became more pronounced. Philosophers and intellectuals, particularly those in the Stoic tradition, began to speak out against the games, arguing that they were a symbol of society's decline. The games were not only violent, but also morally corrupting, fostering a culture of bloodlust and indifference to human life. The death of a gladiator was not just an entertainment, it was a moral failing of the empire. Seneca, one of the most prominent Stoic philosophers of the time, wrote extensively about the cruelty of the gladiatorial games and the degradation they caused. According to Seneca, the games represented a society that had lost its way, a society that had become too desensitized to violence and too hungry for spectacle. Yet, for the people of Rome, the games were more than just entertainment. They were a reflection of the empire's values. The gladiatorial deaths were a manifestation of Roman strength and control, a demonstration of the empire's ability to shape not just the future, but the very essence of life and death itself. For the masses, the death of a gladiator in the arena was not a tragedy. It was an act of glory, an offering to the empire. In the heart of the Roman Empire, amidst its towering structures and bustling streets, there existed a world far removed from the opulence and grandeur of the elite. The gladiators, those infamous warriors who fought for the entertainment of the masses, led lives of unimaginable hardship and peril. Yet, for all the bloodshed and suffering, the motivations of those who entered the gladiatorial schools were as varied as the men themselves. Some came by force, others by choice, but all were driven by a desire, whether for survival, fame, or fortune, that would push them into the brutal world of combat. The gladiatorial schools, or ludi, were where these men would begin their long and torturous journey. For many, entering the world of the gladiators was not a choice, but a desperate necessity. These were not men who sought out the thrill of battle for the sake of glory. For most, it was a means of escape from even more horrific circumstances. Slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war were the most common candidates for the ludus. But even free men found themselves driven to this extreme by poverty or debts that they could never repay. One such man was Spartacus, the name that would become synonymous with gladiatorial rebellion. Spartacus was not born a gladiator. He was born a free man in Thrace, a region known for its fierce warriors. However, his life took a tragic turn when he was captured by Roman forces and sold into slavery. As a slave, Spartacus was forced to train as a gladiator in the ludus of Capua, one of the most renowned gladiatorial schools in the Roman Empire. His motivation was clear: survival. The arena was a death sentence for most, but for Spartacus, it was a way to fight for his life in a world where he had no other choice. The gladiatorial lifestyle, however, was not only forced upon those who were captured or enslaved. Some free men, driven by the promise of fame, fortune, or the desire to escape a life of obscurity, willingly entered the ludus. They were known as auctorati, and their motivations were just as varied as the slaves and prisoners. For many, it was the allure of glory that drew them to the arena. To become a gladiator meant that you could rise to fame, win the admiration of the Roman people, and perhaps even achieve wealth beyond your wildest dreams. The crowds at the Colosseum and other arenas cheered for their favorite gladiators, and the victors were often treated like heroes. Some gladiators were even given their own homes, wealth, and privileges after they had earned enough victories. But the rewards of glory were not easily won, and for most gladiators, the reality of their life was far from the shining image that many free men imagined. Once inside the ludus, the gladiators were subjected to the harshest of training regimens. They were forced to fight each other in brutal combat, often under the supervision of Lanistae, the trainers who ran the schools. The Lanistae were notorious for their cruelty, pushing the gladiators beyond their limits in order to make them stronger, faster, and more deadly. Many gladiators entered the ludus with hopes of fortune or fame, but quickly found themselves fighting for survival. The training was grueling and merciless. Gladiators were taught to wield a variety of weapons: swords, shields, tridents, nets, and even the famous retiarius gear, which included a net and a trident. They would spar with one another in mock battles, often suffering brutal injuries in the process. The most experienced gladiators were pitted against the less skilled in order to sharpen their fighting techniques. Those who were deemed unfit for battle were left to fight in the most dangerous matches, where the chances of survival were slim. The arena was a place where only the strongest survived, and those who failed to meet the expectations of their trainers or the crowds faced a cruel fate. Yet, despite the brutality of the training and the certainty of death in the arena, some gladiators saw their position as a path to freedom. Those who survived long enough in the games were sometimes rewarded with manumission, or the act of being granted freedom. This was the ultimate prize for a gladiator, an escape from slavery or debt, and the chance to live a life outside the brutal confines of the ludus. For many, this was the only hope they had. They knew that the arena was a place where life and death hung in the balance, but they also knew that survival could bring them something that few others had: freedom. One of the most famous examples of this was Flamma, a gladiator who fought in the early days of the Roman Empire. Flamma was a Syrian slave who became one of the most famous and successful gladiators of his time. Over the course of his career, he won many battles and earned the admiration of the Roman people. After accumulating enough victories, he was offered freedom, but he chose to continue fighting. His reasons for staying in the arena were complex. Some believed that he craved the glory of the arena, while others thought that the wealth and fame he had earned as a gladiator made it impossible for him to leave. Either way, Flamma's story was a testament to the complicated motivations of the men who fought in the gladiatorial games. For some, survival and freedom were the ultimate goals, while for others, the glory of the arena was more important than anything else. However, not all gladiators were driven by the promise of freedom or glory. Some entered the ludus out of sheer desperation. These men were often debtor gladiators, individuals who had fallen into debt and had no way out. In ancient Rome, debt could be a life-ruining experience. Many people found themselves sold into slavery to pay off debts that they could never repay. For these individuals, becoming a gladiator was a way to escape their financial ruin. They knew that the road ahead was long and dangerous, but it offered a chance at redemption. The gladiatorial system, with its promise of freedom and fame, was a harsh but effective way to exploit those in desperate situations. It offered them a brutal path to recognition and the possibility of breaking free from their circumstances, but it also forced them to face death head-on. Gladiators who survived the arena could become heroes, their names celebrated throughout Rome, but for most, the cost of that fame was far too high. They were trapped in a cycle of violence and pain fighting not just for glory, but for their lives. In the end, the motivations of the gladiators were as complex as the system that created them. Some fought for freedom, some for glory, and others simply because they had no other choice. The gladiatorial world was one of extreme violence and suffering, where survival meant everything. The men who entered the ludus were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for something far more precious, their hope. Whether that hope was for a better life, freedom from debt, or the chance to become a hero. It was what pushed them to survive in one of the most brutal systems in history. As the life of a gladiator unfolded inside the ludus, the realities of their choices began to take shape in the most stark and brutal ways. Each day was a challenge, a fight against the odds, and for many, a battle against their own fears and doubts. But despite the overwhelming danger and cruelty, there was a constant drive that fueled them. The hope that their time in the arena would lead to something greater, a chance to escape the confines of slavery, poverty, or the crushing weight of debt. For some, the arena was a battleground for their freedom. Unlike the noble soldiers of Rome who fought to protect the empire, gladiators fought for the possibility of manumission, freedom from their owners. A victorious gladiator could win his release, but the odds were slim. The brutality of the training, the cruel nature of the fights, and the sheer number of gladiators who entered the ludus meant that only the strongest and most resilient ever made it out alive. Those who survived long enough earned a reputation, and this reputation, often built on blood, sweat, and tears, could be the key to freedom. There were cases where gladiators, after a long and successful career, would be rewarded with freedom. This was the ultimate aspiration for most, but few actually lived to see it. One such story is that of Priscus, a celebrated gladiator during the reign of Emperor Titus. Priscus fought in the arena to gain the favor of the crowds and the reward of freedom. His fame grew with every victory, and his name became well known in the city of Rome. Eventually, after a series of successful fights, he earned the reward of freedom, a rare prize in the brutal world of gladiatorial combat. Yet, even after receiving his release, Priscus chose to continue fighting, driven not just by the desire for wealth, but by the thrill of battle, the desire for fame, and perhaps even the camaraderie he had developed with fellow gladiators over the years. The case of Priscus reveals a deeper layer of the gladiatorial system, one that involved more than just physical survival. Gladiators were often commodities, their bodies used as instruments of war, entertainment, and commerce. The wealth that came from a gladiator's success was not just a matter of prize money, but also the potential to gain patronage, celebrity, and even a personal following. Roman society was obsessed with spectacle, and gladiators were the stars of the show. They were admired by the people, and were sometimes even sought after by the Roman elite, who saw the gladiators not just as slaves, but as symbols of strength and bravery. The fame that came with this status could offer riches, the respect of powerful people, and the kind of lifestyle that ordinary citizens could only dream of. But this fame was bought at a terrible price. The gladiator's life was defined by violence, suffering, and constant danger. They were pushed to the edge of human endurance, not only physically but mentally. It was a life of hardship, but for some, it was also a path toward glory. Yet not all gladiators fought for freedom or glory. There were many who fought simply because they had no other choice. Debt was one of the most common reasons free men entered the ludus. Rome's economy was built on a fragile foundation of debt, and many Romans, including citizens, found themselves in financial ruin. For these men, becoming a gladiator was often seen as a way to escape their debts. The reality was harsh. Gladiators who entered the arena due to debt often faced the grim possibility of dying without ever seeing the riches that their victories might bring. However, some managed to survive long enough to secure their freedom, or, at the very least, to earn enough to pay off their debts. One such man was Crixus, another key figure in the gladiator rebellion led by Spartacus. Crixus, like many others, was likely motivated by the harsh realities of his life, captured, enslaved, and forced to fight. However, his strength and ambition made him stand out among the ranks of gladiators. Crixus was not content to simply fight for his survival. As his career progressed, he came to see the arena not just as a place of death, but as an opportunity for something more. He could win freedom, gain wealth, and rise to the status of a hero in the eyes of Rome. But as we know, his story would take a darker turn as he joined Spartacus in the rebellion against Rome. The rebellion led by Spartacus is one of the most significant and tragic events in the history of the gladiators. Spartacus and his fellow gladiators, including Crixus, broke free from their captors, turning the gladiatorial system on its head. For Spartacus, the fight was not just about survival or freedom. It was about revenge, about claiming his dignity, and about defying the system that had reduced him to a mere slave. His rebellion, although ultimately crushed, was a powerful symbol of resistance, and it was driven by the same motivations that had brought him to the ludus in the first place: the desire for freedom and self-determination. Spartacus's rebellion was a momentary flash of hope for the oppressed, showing that even those who were treated as mere tools for entertainment could fight back, not only for their survival, but for a life beyond the chains of their masters. The story of Spartacus and his men demonstrated the power of hope, the drive for a better life, and the strength that comes from a desire for justice. But for most gladiators, the rebellion was not the path they chose. The majority continued to fight, knowing that the rewards of freedom and fame were long shots, and the likelihood of surviving the brutal battles of the arena was slim. Still, their reasons for fighting remained. Some did so out of hope that perhaps they would survive long enough to gain their freedom, to become heroes of the arena. Others did it out of necessity, simply to survive another day in a world that offered them few choices. As the gladiators continued their training in the ludus, their lives became defined by the relentless cycle of preparation for the arena. Each day, they endured grueling drills, working tirelessly to hone their skills with swords, shields, and various weapons. Their bodies were pushed to their limits, their muscles ached, and their minds were filled with fear and anticipation. The arena was always in their thoughts, as they knew that only the strongest would survive. But for many, this fear was tempered by the hope of achieving their ultimate goal, freedom. For those who had entered the ludus as slaves, the possibility of winning their freedom was a powerful motivator. Freedom was not just a vague concept, it was a tangible prize, one that could be obtained through blood, sweat, and the relentless pursuit of victory. Every match in the arena, every fight with another gladiator, was a step closer to that elusive dream. While the odds of actually earning manumission were slim, the possibility was enough to drive men like Spartacus and Flamma to endure the pain and suffering of gladiatorial life. But the path to freedom was not easy, and for many, the dream of liberation was nothing more than an illusion. The reality of the gladiator's life was far more complex. The training was brutal, and the fights were often to the death. The men who fought in the arena were not fighting for themselves. They were fighting for the approval of the crowds, for the satisfaction of the Roman elite, and most importantly, for the entertainment of the masses. They were commodities, their value determined by their ability to survive and entertain. In this world, their worth was not measured in terms of humanity, but in terms of their ability to kill and be killed. Yet the glory and fame that came with being a successful gladiator were undeniable. Some men saw the arena as a chance to rise above their station, to become something greater than they were before. Gladiators who won enough matches became famous, their names whispered in the streets of Rome. The crowds would cheer for their favorites, and the victors would be celebrated as heroes. Some gladiators even became wealthy, earning riches from their victories and the sponsorship of powerful patrons. In this sense, the arena was a place of opportunity, albeit a dangerous one, where fame and fortune could be won with the right mix of skill and luck. Flamma, for example, was one of the most famous gladiators of his time. A Syrian slave, he fought in the arenas for over 13 years, earning a reputation as a master of the Thracian style of combat. Over the course of his career, he was offered freedom 4 times. However, Flamma chose to remain a gladiator, not because he could not have his freedom, but because the rewards of the arena were simply too great to pass up. Wealth, fame, and the admiration of the Roman people were more enticing to him than a life outside the arena. Flamma's decision to stay in the ludus reflected a key aspect of the gladiator's mentality: the belief that, despite the hardships and danger, the arena offered the chance to achieve something greater than what they could have outside of it. However, not all gladiators were motivated by fame or wealth. Some were driven by a desire for revenge. The experience of being forced into the gladiatorial lifestyle was often traumatic, and many gladiators sought to exact revenge on the system that had enslaved them. Spartacus, for instance, was not simply fighting for his freedom. He was fighting against the empire that had taken everything from him. As an enslaved Thracian, Spartacus was brought to Rome against his will and forced into the gladiatorial arena. But Spartacus did not accept his fate passively. Instead, he chose to fight back, leading a massive revolt against Rome itself. His rebellion, though ultimately defeated, was a powerful symbol of defiance. For Spartacus, the arena was not just a place of combat, it was the beginning of a larger fight for justice. The motivations of gladiators were also influenced by the bond they formed with one another. Crixus, one of Spartacus's key lieutenants, exemplifies how solidarity among gladiators could form in the face of a common enemy. Crixus was known for his fierceness in the arena and his loyalty to Spartacus. Like many gladiators, Crixus initially entered the ludus out of necessity. He was captured and sold into slavery, forced to fight for survival. However, over time, he came to see the gladiators' struggle as a larger cause, one that went beyond individual survival. His bond with Spartacus and the other gladiators who joined the rebellion was a reflection of the deep camaraderie that often formed between these men. They were united not just by their shared hardships, but also by a desire to break free from the chains of their captors, and the system that had used them as mere tools for entertainment. For some gladiators, however, the choice to fight in the arena was driven by economic necessity rather than the desire for freedom or glory. The ludus was often seen as a last resort for those who had no other options. Debt was a common motivator for free men who entered the gladiatorial schools. In Rome, debts could lead to a lifetime of servitude, and many men found themselves selling their services as gladiators in exchange for the promise of payment. The grim reality of debt could force even the most determined individuals into the arena, knowing that their chances of surviving the fights were slim, but their chances of paying off their debts were even slimmer. One such example is the story of Decimus, a Roman citizen who, in the face of overwhelming debt, chose to enter the gladiatorial school. Desperate, and with no other means of repaying his debts, Decimus threw himself into the brutal world of gladiatorial combat. His story reflects the darker side of the gladiatorial system, where men were pushed to fight for their lives not out of a sense of honor or glory, but out of sheer desperation. These gladiators were often nameless, forgotten by history, their lives reduced to mere numbers in the grand spectacle of the arena. For them, the gladiatorial school was a prison, one from which there was no escape unless they were fortunate enough to survive long enough to earn their freedom. While the most famous gladiators like Spartacus, Crixus, and Flamma are remembered for their courage, strength, and eventual defiance against the Roman system, the vast majority of gladiators lived and died in obscurity. Their lives were marked by brutality and fear, and their motivations were often driven by circumstances beyond their control. Whether they fought for freedom, glory, wealth, revenge, or simply out of necessity, their stories are intertwined with the history of Rome itself. The gladiators, despite their different paths and reasons for entering the arena, were all bound by a shared fate, a fate defined by the arena, where death and glory coexisted in a never-ending cycle of blood and survival. As the gladiators fought in the arenas of ancient Rome, they were not just warriors. They were symbols of the empire's power, of the human spirit's capacity to endure unimaginable suffering for the sake of entertainment. The public viewed them as larger-than-life figures, heroes and villains in equal measure. and their lives were often defined by how they were perceived by the crowds. The applause of thousands could turn a gladiator into a legend, while the silence of a death in the arena could ensure that his name was lost to history. The arena was the ultimate stage, and for many gladiators, it was the only opportunity they had to make a name for themselves. However, for most, their motivation was survival, plain and simple. Every fight was a gamble, a roll of the dice where the stakes were life and death. It was a world where the bravest and most skilled could gain fortune and fame. But the majority fought to stay alive for just one more day. The odds were stacked against them, but despite the constant threat of death, many gladiators believed that their victories might lead to something more, something greater than just survival. This hope was what motivated men like Commodus, the emperor of Rome, to enter the arena himself. Commodus, unlike other emperors, actually fought in gladiatorial contests. His participation was not about necessity or escape from debt. It was about personal glory and control. Commodus was notorious for his desire to be adored by the people, and by entering the arena, he believed he could achieve the same level of adoration as the greatest gladiators. He fought in public spectacles, where he would often face opponents who were unarmed or less experienced. His actions reflected the contradictions of the gladiatorial system, where the line between the powerful and the powerless was blurred, and where the emperor himself could adopt the role of a gladiator. For the ordinary gladiators, however, life in the arena was far less glamorous. They were mere mortals, forced to fight in the shadows of the elites, their fates controlled by the whims of their masters. The true gladiators, those who fought for freedom, fame, or money, lived and died in the arena, their bodies broken by countless battles. Many who entered the ludus did so with the hope that their participation would lead to reward or recognition. But the majority were forgotten in death, their names erased from history. The stories of Spartacus and Crixus stand out because they reflect not just the struggle for survival, but a desire for freedom that transcended the brutality of the arena. When Spartacus and his followers rebelled against the Romans, they did not just revolt against their masters. They rebelled against the entire system that treated them as nothing more than tools of entertainment. Their motivation was not simply to escape the arena, but to strike at the heart of an empire that had created a system of slavery and exploitation. The rebellion led by Spartacus is remembered as one of the greatest uprisings in history, though it was ultimately crushed by Roman legions. Spartacus's leadership and his unwavering desire for freedom were what inspired his fellow gladiators to rise up against the might of Rome. Spartacus was not fighting for wealth or fame. He was fighting for dignity and the right to live as a free man. The rebellion, though unsuccessful in its ultimate goal, served as a reminder that even the most oppressed could rise up against their oppressors and fight for something greater than themselves. For Crixus, the motivation to fight was more personal. Crixus had grown weary of the endless bloodshed in the arena and had long dreamt of escape. His decision to join Spartacus's rebellion was fueled not just by a desire for freedom, but by a deep sense of resentment against the Romans who had enslaved him. Like many gladiators, Crixus had been captured in battle and forced into the ludus. The brutality he faced in the arena, combined with the knowledge that he would never be truly free, drove him to seek out a different path, a path that led him to rebellion. Despite the chaos and danger of the rebellion, the hope that it offered was infectious. The gladiators who joined Spartacus were motivated not just by their desire to escape the ludus, but by the belief that they could defeat the Romans. They were no longer fighting for entertainment. They were fighting for their lives and the chance to create a new world outside the brutal confines of the gladiatorial system. However, the overwhelming power of Rome, along with the strategic brilliance of the Roman generals, eventually led to the collapse of the rebellion. The defeat of Spartacus and his followers was a blow to the hope that had inspired them, but it was also a testament to their resilience and their desire for something better. For many gladiators, even those who never participated in the rebellion, the ultimate hope was to earn manumission, the possibility of being freed from their captors. Though rare, the chance for a gladiator to gain freedom was not an impossible dream. It was a goal, a drive that could push men through the hell of the ludus and into the spotlight of the arena. It was a goal that kept them moving forward, even when their bodies were broken, when their spirits were crushed, and when they knew that death was always one fight away. There were other gladiators, though, who fought not for freedom or glory, but for something more personal, the desire to prove themselves. These men, often those who had no other options, found in the arena the only place where they could gain recognition for their strength, skill, and resilience. For these gladiators, the arena was a place where they could establish their worth in a world that often treated them as worthless. It was a world where every victory was a testament to their perseverance, and where every defeat could mean the end of their lives. But for all the gladiators who fought with dreams of glory or freedom, there were many more who fought simply to survive. These men entered the ludus not because they wanted to become famous or wealthy, but because it was the only option left to them. They fought not for rewards, but for life itself. These gladiators were driven by the knowledge that the arena was their one chance to escape the cycle of violence and oppression that defined their existence. They fought not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. In the end, the motivations of the gladiators were as varied as the men who entered the arena. Some sought freedom, others sought fame, and some fought out of sheer desperation. Yet, despite their differences, they were all bound by a single common goal: to survive. The gladiatorial system, with all its brutality and cruelty, provided the opportunity for a few to rise above their station, to gain fame and fortune. But for most, it was a death sentence, a harsh reminder that in the world of the gladiators, the only thing that truly mattered was survival. As we dive deeper into the lives of gladiators, it's important to understand the constant tension that shaped every part of their existence. The daily struggle to survive, the hope for a better future, and the ever-present reality of death. For gladiators, life was a balance between hope and fear, between fighting for freedom and the knowledge that their life could be taken at any moment in the arena. This constant state of tension was what made the gladiatorial system both so brutal and, for some, so compelling. The gladiatorial arena, despite its fame for cruelty and violence, became a place where some gladiators sought to make a name for themselves. The ambition to rise above their humble beginnings and achieve recognition was a powerful motivator. Yet, the path to fame and fortune was fraught with peril. Even the most skilled fighters were never certain of survival. In fact, the very nature of the arena ensured that every fight, every performance, was a gamble with their life. Some gladiators entered the games with the hope that they could break free from the chains of poverty or slavery, and prove themselves as something more than just slaves or criminals. They saw the arena not just as a place of death, but as a stage where their lives could be transformed. They knew the risks, but they also knew that if they won enough battles, they could achieve something greater than most Romans could ever imagine: fame, wealth, and the respect of the people. One such gladiator was Murray, a man who was forced into the arena as a young boy due to his family's crippling debt. He was not born into slavery, but the financial ruin of his family led to his capture and eventual sale to a gladiatorial school. For Murray, the fight was not just about survival, it was about proving his worth. He wasn't fighting to escape a life of servitude, he was fighting for the chance to rise above it. Every fight was an opportunity to gain respect, to become someone. Despite the overwhelming odds, Murray fought with passion and determination. His name became known throughout the empire, not for his skills alone, but for his defiance. Despite his humble origins, he rose to prominence, eventually earning enough victories to become a free man. His story became one of the rare exceptions in the gladiatorial world. A gladiator who went from being a debtor to achieving freedom and fame. But Murray's story was not the norm. Most gladiators did not achieve this level of success, and for many, the arena was their grave. For every success story, there were hundreds of gladiators who died young, their names forgotten by history. Yet, even those who died in the arena became part of something larger than themselves. The spectacle of gladiatorial combat was central to Roman life, and even in death, these men contributed to the cultural identity of Rome. Gladiators were part of the fabric of Roman society, not just as slaves or fighters, but as symbols of Roman endurance, the belief that strength and courage could overcome any obstacle. However, the concept of freedom was more than just an abstract notion for these men. It was something that could be earned, but also something that could be taken away. For some, the possibility of winning their freedom was what kept them going. Yet, this possibility was often out of reach. Many gladiators fought not with the belief that they could achieve greatness, but with the hope that perhaps one day they would be freed by the hand of their master, or, if they survived long enough, by the Roman system itself. Crixus, another key figure in the Spartacus rebellion, fought not just for glory or fame, but for revenge. His motivation was driven by the desire to break free from the oppression that had trapped him in the ludus. Crixus had been captured in battle and forced into the brutal life of a gladiator. But as his strength grew, so did his anger. He was not just fighting for survival, He was fighting to break the chains of his enslavement and to strike back against those who had used him as a mere tool for sport. His journey from gladiator to rebel leader is a powerful reminder that not all gladiators entered the arena with dreams of wealth or fame. For some, the arena was a place of retribution, a place where they could seek justice for the wrongs done to them. The gladiatorial system had, over time, created a paradox. Gladiators, despite their status as slaves, were often celebrated as heroes. The crowds adored their favorites, cheered for their victories, and mourned their deaths. Yet for the gladiators themselves, their reality was anything but glamorous. They lived in a constant state of fear, not knowing when their number might be called, when they would face their final battle. The arena, despite its allure of fame and fortune, was a place of violence and death. The gladiators fought not just against their opponents, but against the system that had trapped them. They fought for a future that was uncertain, a future where survival was often the only victory they could claim. In the case of Spartacus, the stakes were even higher. His rebellion was not just about his own survival, but about defying the entire system of Roman slavery. For Spartacus, the fight was personal, but it was also universal. He was not only fighting for his freedom, but for the freedom of those like him, those who had been born into servitude, those who had been captured and forced into gladiatorial combat, and those who had no hope of escape. Spartacus became a symbol of resistance, not just in the gladiatorial schools, but in the wider Roman world. His rebellion showed that even the most oppressed people could rise up and challenge their oppressors. Yet, even in the face of such resistance, the gladiatorial system remained a powerful force. The rewards of the arena, though few, were enticing enough to draw in men from all walks of life. Gladiators like Priscus, another famous figure, fought for glory and the possibility of wealth, while others fought simply to survive. For each gladiator, the path they chose was deeply personal, shaped by their circumstances, their hopes, and their dreams. But no matter the reason for their entry into the arena, all gladiators were bound by the same harsh reality. The life they lived was one of constant struggle, and survival was the only true prize. The gladiatorial games, a hallmark of ancient Rome, are among the most iconic and brutal spectacles in history. They were not merely a form of entertainment, but a reflection of Roman society's values, its views on power, control, and the human capacity for violence. At their core, these games were about dominance, death, and glory. But they also revealed deeper aspects of Roman culture, its obsession with spectacle, its sense of hierarchy, and its complex relationship with both life and death. Over the centuries, the legacy of gladiatorial combat has influenced countless aspects of society, from entertainment to cultural perceptions of violence, and the role of public spectacle in shaping collective identity. In ancient Rome, the gladiatorial games were more than just violent contests. They were a symbol of Roman strength and power, designed to showcase the might of the empire. Gladiators were not only trained to fight, they were trained to embody the very essence of Rome's conquest and dominance over other civilizations. The games were held in grand amphitheaters, with the Colosseum being the most famous example. These arenas were not only venues for combat, but also symbols of the Roman Empire's ability to control life and death. The gladiatorial games were also a tool of social control. They allowed Roman emperors to placate the masses, to distract them from political or economic problems by offering them the thrill of bloodshed. The phrase bread and circuses, coined by the Roman poet Juvenal, refers to the Roman practice of providing free grain and entertainment to the people to keep them content and distracted. The gladiatorial contests were central to this strategy. By providing a continuous stream of violence and spectacle, the emperors ensured that the populace remained pacified, entertained, and ultimately loyal to the regime. The games were a method of political manipulation, a way to prevent civil unrest by distracting the public from the underlying problems of the empire. But the gladiatorial games also shaped Roman cultural identity in profound ways. They reinforced the value placed on strength, bravery, and martial prowess. Gladiators, despite being slaves or criminals, were elevated to the status of heroes in the eyes of the public. They embodied the Roman ideals of resilience and valor, even though they were often treated as mere tools for entertainment. A successful gladiator, like Spartacus, who rose from the ranks of the enslaved to lead a revolt against the Romans, could attain a level of fame and respect that rivaled even the most celebrated warriors. However, the gladiators' fame was fleeting. Most gladiators lived short, brutal lives, and the success stories were few and far between. They were disposable. Their lives counted not in years, but in battles fought. Despite their brief existence in the public eye, the gladiators' legacy endured in the very nature of the empire that created them. They became symbols not only of violence, but also of the fleeting nature of fame, and the ways in which society can dehumanize individuals to create an entertainment spectacle. The gladiatorial games were a reflection of the empire's view on human life: expendable, disposable, and ultimately replaceable. The gladiatorial games also had a significant impact on the arts and literature of the time. Writers, poets, and artists of ancient Rome were deeply influenced by the themes of violence, death, and glory that permeated the games. The games provided rich material for the artists of the time, inspiring plays, sculptures, and paintings that depicted the brutal combat in the arena. Seneca, the philosopher and statesman, wrote extensively on the effects of the games on the Roman psyche. He argued that they were not just cruel spectacles, but a reflection of the moral decay of Roman society. According to Seneca, the games represented the decadence and loss of human dignity that were taking place within the empire. But the most enduring legacy of the gladiatorial games is perhaps their influence on modern entertainment. In many ways, the modern world's obsession with violent sports, films, and reality television is a direct descendant of the gladiatorial contests. The thrill of combat, the spectacle of bloodshed, and the vicarious pleasure of watching others fight for their lives are elements that continue to captivate audiences around the world. Gladiatorial games were, in essence, the first reality show, with the lives of the contestants held in balance for the public's entertainment. The idea that people could watch others fight for their lives and feel pleasure from it continues to echo in modern entertainment, from mixed martial arts to blockbuster action films. Moreover, the gladiatorial games influenced how we perceive violence and death. In ancient Rome, the public nature of the games and their open display of bloodshed created a culture where death was something to be witnessed, something to be consumed by the masses. In the modern world, while public executions are no longer the norm, the consumption of violence in media, whether in sports or films, still resonates with Roman society's views on death. Just as the crowds in ancient Rome cheered for the fighters in the arena, modern audiences often cheer for the spectacle of violence, even when it is fictional. But as we reflect on the legacy of gladiatorial combat, we must also consider the darker aspects of that legacy. The games were not just about spectacle and entertainment. They were a means of control, of reinforcing the empire's power over its subjects. Gladiators were not seen as human beings, but as commodities, objects to be used for entertainment. Their lives were disposable, and their deaths were celebrated, with the empire benefiting from the violence that they staged. In this sense, the gladiatorial games serve as a reminder of the ways in which societies can dehumanize individuals to maintain power, and the inherent violence in systems that value spectacle over humanity. In modern times, we continue to wrestle with similar issues, particularly in the world of sports and entertainment. While gladiatorial combat is no longer a part of our culture, the desire for violent spectacle remains ever present. Whether it's through the lens of sports, films, or reality TV, we still consume violence for entertainment, just as the Romans did centuries ago. The gladiatorial games have left an indelible mark on our cultural psyche. And while we may have evolved from the physical bloodshed of ancient Rome, the psychological allure of violence remains as strong as ever. The gladiatorial games, while deeply rooted in Roman history, left behind an enduring influence that permeated much of the empire's culture, and eventually the broader Western world. As we explore the legacy of the gladiatorial games, it is clear that they did not only impact the citizens of ancient Rome in their time, but also influenced future generations, shaping the course of entertainment, social structures, and even the philosophy of violence and human suffering. This influence can still be seen today, from the structure of modern entertainment to the values that underpin many of our competitive sports. One of the most significant ways the gladiatorial games shaped Roman society was through their social functions. The games were a primary means of displaying Roman power, wealth, and cultural superiority. Gladiators were symbols of strength, and their contests, whether fought to the death or not, embodied the values that Rome sought to project: dominance, control, and endurance. They weren't just soldiers on display, they were tools of political strategy. Roman emperors understood that the people needed entertainment. But more than that, they needed to feel a sense of unity and loyalty to the empire. The gladiators, with their courage, skill, and willingness to die for the entertainment of the crowds, became symbols of Roman ideals of strength, fortitude, and self-sacrifice. The games also played an important role in defining the relationship between the rulers and the ruled. While the Roman elite watched the games from their luxurious seats, the lower classes found in the games not only an outlet for entertainment, but a way to gain status and prestige. Gladiators were sometimes treated as heroes, though often fleetingly, and their fame could transcend their status as slaves or criminals. The most celebrated gladiators, like Commodus, who would go on to become emperor, were seen as almost divine figures, a mixture of fighter, entertainer, and embodiment of the Roman virtue of martial excellence. This dichotomy between the brutal treatment of the gladiators and the hero worship they received from the public highlights the contradictions within Roman society. Even those considered expendable by the system could become icons, briefly rising above their stations as a result of their participation in the games. This phenomenon of deifying gladiators was not just a passing fancy. Over time, their fame became a part of the Roman economy itself. Gladiatorial combat became a commodity, where powerful men could gamble on gladiator fights or sponsor certain competitors to win, all while basking in the prestige that came from supporting the games. The social mobility of the gladiators, rare as it was a striking example of how these games also served as a form of Roman propaganda. Gladiators were not simply fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their place in history, and in some cases, for the possibility of achieving immortality through their performances. In fact, much of what we understand about the Roman mindset today comes from their cultural obsession with spectacle, death, and the transitory nature of fame. The gladiatorial games were the pinnacle of this obsession. Emperors, politicians, and wealthy elites did not just attend these events for sport. They used them as opportunities to make political statements. A grand display of gladiatorial combat could be used to appease the masses, to demonstrate the emperor's power, or to mark a significant occasion like a military victory or a major public holiday. The scale and frequency of these events were staggering. According to historical records, during the reign of Emperor Trajan, more than 5,000 animals were slaughtered in a single day at his inauguration games. The enormity of such events speaks to the vast influence that the gladiatorial games had in shaping public opinion and legitimizing power in Rome. But the gladiatorial games were not just about death. They were about the will to survive. The gladiators themselves, though they were often slaves or criminals, had a sense of personal ambition despite their grim circumstances. Some entered the games voluntarily, seduced by the promises of fame, wealth, or freedom. Others, like Spartacus, were forced into gladiatorial combat by fate, but found within themselves the will to fight for something greater: freedom, revenge, or even revolution. Gladiators were not simply pawns in a cruel system. They were individuals, each with their own motivations. This made their stories even more compelling, both for the Roman public at the time and for us, centuries later. Their stories became legends, immortalized not only in historical texts, but also in the popular culture of the Roman Empire. They were celebrated in epic poetry, plays, and public art. The most famous gladiators, like Spartacus, achieved a kind of mythical status. The rebellion he led against the Romans became a symbol of resistance, of the desire to break free from oppression. Spartacus' name lived on long after his death. In a way, his fight represented the eternal human struggle against forces that sought to break the human spirit. While the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it would remain a powerful symbol of defiance throughout history. The legacy of gladiators didn't end with the fall of the Roman Empire. The cultural and social impact of the games would continue to echo throughout history. In the Middle Ages, jousting tournaments and knightly combat rituals, while less brutal, echoed the same themes of martial prowess, honor, and public spectacle. These events, which often had roots in the medieval courtly traditions, harked back to the gladiatorial contests of Rome, celebrating physical strength and bravery in front of a cheering crowd. Fast forward to the modern world, and the gladiatorial legacy is still with us. The most obvious influence is in modern sports. Boxing, wrestling, mixed martial arts, and even football can trace their origins back to the gladiatorial contests. While these sports have evolved considerably, they still carry the same basic elements that made the ancient games so popular. Physical prowess, competition, and the spectacle of violence and endurance. These modern sports, while regulated and controlled, still embody the Roman idea of public spectacle and personal sacrifice for the enjoyment of the masses. Beyond sports, the legacy of the gladiatorial games can be seen in modern entertainment, especially in action movies, television series, and video games. Films like Gladiator or the gladiator-themed video games capture the essence of gladiatorial combat. These portrayals, while fictionalized, draw on the deep-seated fascination with human endurance, spectacle, and violence. The gladiatorial games created a cultural framework for how we view strength, bravery, and the sacrifice that is often required in pursuit of glory. Even in the digital age, we see the same patterns that were established in Rome. Individuals pushing themselves to the limit for the sake of fame, recognition, or just pure survival. Thus, the legacy of the gladiatorial games is not confined to the distant past. It remains a living tradition, one that continues to influence how we perceive competition, spectacle, and the darker aspects of human nature. The gladiators may have been slaves or criminals, but through their bloodshed, they carved their place in history, forever shaping the way we think about violence, entertainment, and heroism. The gladiatorial games were an essential part of Roman life, and their cultural significance was immense. These events were not only spectacles for the masses, but also a reflection of the Roman mindset, its understanding of power, violence, and the relationship between the individual and the state. The games were a way to showcase the empire's dominance, maintain social order, and reinforce the values of discipline, courage, and sacrifice. The gladiators, despite their low social status, became symbols of these virtues. Their lives, though brief and brutal, were immortalized through the games, and ultimately through their legacy in Roman culture. Yet, as we look at the aftermath of the gladiatorial games and their effects on Roman society, we must also consider the moral and ethical implications of the games. For all their excitement, the gladiatorial contests were barbaric by modern standards. They were a reflection of a society that placed little value on the lives of individuals, particularly those of lower status. Gladiators were viewed as expendable, tools for entertainment whose lives could be discarded as easily as they were used. This exploitation, however, was not seen as an injustice at the time. Rather, it was a means of keeping the people entertained while maintaining the Roman elite's control over the masses. The games served to desensitize the public to violence. The constant bloodshed in the arena, witnessed by thousands of people, became a normal part of Roman life. The spectacle of human suffering was something to be celebrated, not condemned. This normalization of violence would have lasting consequences, influencing the way Romans viewed life and death. The gladiators, who fought and died for the entertainment of the public, became living reminders of the empire's power, but also of its moral decay. For all their physical prowess and courage, gladiators were ultimately trapped in a system that used them as mere tools of spectacle, rendering their lives disposable. In a broader sense, the gladiatorial games can be seen as an expression of the imperial ideology that defined Rome. The games were an assertion of Roman superiority, proof of the empire's ability to dominate not just the world, but the very lives of those who lived within its boundaries. The gladiators, though forced into their roles, were caught in a complex web of cultural expectations. They were simultaneously worshipped as heroes and vilified as slaves, the ultimate symbols of both victory and subjugation. The decline of gladiatorial combat in Rome came in the wake of Christian influence. The rise of Christianity in the late Roman Empire brought with it a new set of moral values, particularly with respect to the sanctity of human life. The early Christian Church viewed the gladiatorial games as barbaric and in direct conflict with Christian teachings about the inherent dignity of every human being. As Christianity spread, the games came under increasing moral scrutiny. The first significant steps to curb the games came in the 4th century AD, under the rule of Emperor Constantine, who abolished them in 332 AD. The end of the gladiatorial games marked the decline of one of the most brutal and beloved traditions in ancient Rome. However, the legacy of the gladiators did not die with the decline of the games. The influence of gladiatorial combat lived on in the form of public executions, where criminals were often sentenced to fight wild animals or be executed in a public spectacle. Even as gladiatorial combat was outlawed, the idea of entertainment through violence remained deeply ingrained in Roman society. Over the centuries, this fascination with public spectacle would re-emerge in various forms of entertainment, including medieval jousting tournaments, bullfighting, and later in modern sports like boxing and mixed martial arts. The gladiatorial legacy lives on in the cultural fabric of societies that continue to find entertainment in watching physical conflict. This enduring fascination with gladiatorial combat and public spectacle is not just a relic of the past. It still holds a place in contemporary culture. The gladiator archetype, the brave, self-sacrificial hero who fights against insurmountable odds, remains a popular figure in modern storytelling. From films like Gladiator to video games like Mortal Kombat and Assassin's Creed, the imagery of gladiators continues to resonate with audiences. These modern retellings of gladiatorial combat often romanticize the violence, casting the gladiator as a tragic hero who, despite being exploited and oppressed, rises to greatness. This is evident not only in the media, but in the way sports culture has evolved. The idea of athletes as modern gladiators, fighting for glory and fame in front of a crowd, mirrors the same dynamics that existed in the ancient games. But while the gladiatorial games served as a form of entertainment for the masses, they also had a significant impact on how violence and death are portrayed in modern media. Gladiators became symbols of the sacrifice involved in striving for greatness, of endurance in the face of death, and of the human will to survive against all odds. Even in films and television shows, where gladiators are now depicted as fictionalized or heroic characters, the essence of their struggle, fighting for survival, recognition, and sometimes freedom, is still a central theme. The gladiator's struggle remains an enduring motif in stories about overcoming adversity, the fight for justice, and the quest for meaning in a world that can often seem indifferent to human suffering. The Roman gladiators, who once fought for their very survival in the sand and dust of the arena, left behind a legacy that continues to shape our culture today. The influence of their battles, the value placed on strength and endurance, and the role of public spectacle in our lives all trace their origins back to those brutal contests. The gladiatorial games were a product of their time, brutal, bloody, and emblematic of an empire that valued spectacle over humanity. But their legacy is more than just a story of violence. It is also a story of resilience, of the human spirit's capacity to endure, and of the lengths to which individuals are willing to go in pursuit of something greater, even if that something is fleeting and ultimately self-destructive. In the modern world, we continue to engage with the same impulses that made the gladiatorial games so popular. We find ourselves drawn to violent spectacles, whether through sports, media, or even the narratives we create about conflict and victory. The gladiators may have fought for their freedom, their honor, or simply for survival. But their story is our story, too. It speaks to the dark side of human nature, to our fascination with power and violence, but also to our drive for meaning, recognition, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. As the centuries passed and the Roman Empire fell, the legacy of the gladiatorial games did not fade into oblivion. Instead, it morphed and adapted, seeping into the cultural fabric of later societies, and influencing the very nature of public entertainment, sports, and the relationship between violence and spectacle in the modern world. While gladiatorial combat itself became a relic of ancient Rome, the cultural and psychological underpinnings of the games lived on, evolving in ways that continue to resonate today. In the Middle Ages, the idea of public combat did not disappear entirely. The tournaments held by knights were reminiscent of gladiatorial games, though less brutal in nature. Jousting, with its focus on physical prowess and the glory of the victor, echoed the same competitive spirit that drove gladiators to fight in the arenas. These tournaments, like their Roman predecessors, were held not only as displays of strength, but also as means of prestige and political gain. The knights who participated were often celebrated in much the same way that gladiators had been in Roman times. The tournaments were also attended by large crowds, which turned them into public spectacles of violence and skill, designed to entertain and awe. In this way, the medieval tournaments were a natural continuation of the gladiatorial traditions, where the fight for honor and the display of strength became the centerpiece of social and political life. But it was in modern sports that the true legacy of the gladiators became fully realized. The gladiators, with their physicality, strength, and will to survive, were the direct forerunners of the athletes we celebrate today. Modern sports, from boxing and mixed martial arts to football and rugby, owe much of their structure and appeal to the gladiatorial games. The athletes of today, like the gladiators of ancient Rome, are revered for their ability to endure pain, compete under pressure, and, in many cases, sacrifice their bodies for the entertainment of the masses. Though modern sports are regulated and safety measures are in place to protect athletes, the spectacle of violence that defined the gladiatorial games still exists in the form of high-contact sports, where the thrill of physical competition and the possibility of injury are ever present. Even beyond the realm of physical sports, the concept of spectacle, a display of power, strength, and violence, remains central to modern entertainment. Films, video games, and television shows that depict combat, war, and battle are direct descendants of the gladiatorial tradition. Whether it's in the form of Hollywood action films like Gladiator, where actors portray heroic warriors in fictionalized versions of ancient Rome, or in video games like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, the gladiatorial ethos endures. These modern forms of entertainment continue to celebrate physical strength, resilience, and the willingness to face violence head-on, just as gladiators did in the arenas. The films and media of the modern era, though not explicitly about gladiators, often explore themes that mirror the gladiatorial spirit. Heroes in these stories are often forced into combat, pitted against overwhelming odds, and challenged by powerful enemies. They must face violence and death, and their ultimate survival hinges not only on their physical abilities, but on their will to endure and fight. In essence, these modern heroes reflect the gladiators of old warriors who must fight not just for themselves, but for something greater, be it freedom, justice, or honor. Another major impact of the gladiatorial games on contemporary society can be seen in the political power of spectacle. The gladiators were used as tools of political manipulation in ancient Rome, serving to placate the masses, boost the public image of emperors, and distract from social and economic problems. In the same way, modern politicians often use spectacles, whether in the form of mass gatherings, sports events, or reality television, to manipulate public opinion. The modern version of bread and circuses can be seen in the use of celebrity culture and public events to maintain social stability and keep people distracted from deeper political or economic issues. Much like the gladiatorial games, these spectacles are used to keep the public entertained while maintaining the status quo. However, the influence of the gladiatorial games extends beyond entertainment and politics. The gladiatorial games raised fundamental questions about human nature and the value of life, questions that continue to be relevant today. The gladiators' lives, often seen as expendable by the Roman elite, were spent in service of the spectacle. Yet, they were also embodiments of resilience and human strength. Their willingness to fight to the death for the sake of the crowd created a paradoxical admiration for their suffering, bravery, and sacrifice. In modern times, this fascination with the human spirit's capacity to endure continues to captivate audiences. As we still seek heroes who can withstand adversity and emerge victorious, even when the odds are against them. The gladiatorial games, through their brutality, forced ancient Rome to confront the nature of life, death, and entertainment. The gladiators were not just objects of bloodlust. They were part of a larger cultural conversation about the value of sacrifice, the need for heroes, and the human obsession with both violence and spectacle. In the same way, our modern engagement with gladiatorial themes continues to force us to question how we value human lives, especially those who are forced into situations of extreme suffering, whether for our entertainment or for the perceived greater good. This exploration of human suffering and endurance has become a dominant theme in modern culture. We watch athletes, soldiers, and performers push their bodies and minds to the brink of destruction, often celebrating their pain as much as their triumphs. The legacy of the gladiators, then, is not just about ancient combat. It is about the ongoing human fascination with sacrifice, resilience, and the thrill of survival. The gladiators' fights, their deaths, and their fleeting moments of glory are mirrored in the way we consume modern entertainment, sports, and even news, always seeking the next spectacle, the next hero who will rise above adversity and inspire us all with their endurance. Despite the violence and cruelty of their lives, the gladiators left a legacy that transcended their time, one that still affects the way we perceive the world today. Their story is one of tragedy, but also one of enduring strength and resilience, a story that continues to inspire and haunt us in equal measure. As we continue to examine the legacy of the gladiatorial games, it is important to recognize how the games shaped the culture of Rome, not just in terms of entertainment, but in their influence on the empire's philosophy, religion, and views on human life. The gladiators, though they were exploited as mere tools for public spectacle, were also paradoxically elevated to the status of symbols, symbols of strength, courage, and sacrifice. In a world where death and violence were daily realities, the gladiatorial games served as both a way to entertain and to reflect on the transient nature of life. In this way, the gladiators' legacy has influenced how societies view suffering, violence, and heroism, echoing through centuries and into modern times. Roman philosophy was deeply connected to the gladiatorial games, especially as it pertained to the Stoic ideals that pervaded Roman thought. The Stoics believed in the value of enduring hardship and remaining virtuous in the face of suffering. Gladiators, in their willingness to face death in the arena, embodied the Stoic ideals of resilience and strength of character. The Roman philosopher Seneca, who served as an advisor to Emperor Nero, often reflected on the brutal nature of the gladiatorial games, criticizing the empire's obsession with violence. However, his critiques were not just moralistic. They were philosophical, asking whether such bloodshed was truly consistent with the values of Roman society. Seneca, in his writings, noted the inherent contradictions within the Roman world, where gladiators were both revered and despised. He argued that the games revealed the empire's moral decay, as it had become a society in which entertainment and violence were intertwined, and human life was treated as disposable. Yet, for all his criticism, Seneca also admired the bravery and stoic endurance of gladiators. In a sense, gladiators, in their willingness to embrace the violence of the arena, became the epitome of Roman ideals, even if they were caught in a system that treated them as nothing more than tools for public spectacle. This idea of the gladiator as a symbol of resilience continued to evolve throughout history. As Rome transitioned from its imperial heights to the rise of Christianity, the games slowly faded away, but the gladiatorial ethos, particularly the idea of the sacrifice for something greater, found a new home in religious thought. Early Christians, many of whom had witnessed or been victims of the gladiatorial games, came to view the games as a symbol of everything wrong with the world they were striving to reform. To them, the gladiatorial contests represented a worldly obsession with violence and power that stood in stark contrast to their ideals of peace, compassion, and the sanctity of life. However, despite the rise of Christianity and the eventual outlawing of gladiatorial combat in the 4th century, the cultural and psychological impact of the games did not vanish. Christian martyrs, who often faced horrific deaths for their beliefs, were frequently compared to gladiators. The early Christian church adopted the imagery of the gladiator as a metaphor for spiritual struggle and self-sacrifice. Just as the gladiators fought to the death in the arena for the entertainment of the masses, the martyrs were seen as fighting for their faith, willing to face death for a greater cause. In this way, the gladiatorial games transcended their origins as public entertainment. They became woven into the cultural consciousness, becoming a symbol of the struggle between life and death, and of sacrifice in the pursuit of something higher. This symbolism carried into medieval culture, where knights and other warriors were often depicted as modern-day gladiators, facing battles not for mere survival, but for honor, glory, and faith. The gladiators' willingness to endure pain and suffering for the sake of their cause became a theme that would persist through history, particularly in religious and chivalric traditions. As Western society evolved, the influence of gladiatorial combat on culture became even more pronounced. Medieval jousting tournaments were essentially a sanitized version of gladiatorial games, where knights competed for honor and glory. But the violence of the ancient Roman games was replaced with a more stylized and ritualized form of combat. Jousting tournaments were not only a display of strength and bravery, but were also a key part of the social and political structure of medieval Europe. Much like the gladiators of ancient Rome, the knights who participated in these tournaments were often celebrated and adored by the masses. But they, too, were risking their lives for the spectacle. In the modern world, the legacy of the gladiatorial games can be seen in competitive sports, particularly in high-contact athletic contests like boxing, wrestling, and mixed martial arts, MMA. These sports, while regulated for safety, still carry the echoes of gladiatorial combat. In fact, many modern athletes are hailed as modern gladiators. Their physical and mental endurance celebrated in much the same way that the gladiators were celebrated by the crowds of ancient Rome. The arena, in both its physical and metaphorical sense, continues to be a space where athletes fight for glory, fame, and the admiration of the masses. The continuing fascination with gladiatorial combat also permeates popular culture. The success of films such as Gladiator, 2005, with its portrayal of a gladiator's struggle for freedom and revenge, shows just how deeply the concept of gladiators resonates with modern audiences. The heroic journey of the gladiator, who fights not just for survival, but for a higher purpose, is a timeless narrative that has been adapted and reinterpreted countless times. Whether in cinema, literature, or video games, the gladiator remains a symbol of endurance and the human spirit's triumph over adversity. Furthermore, the concept of the gladiatorial spectacle continues to influence the ways in which we experience entertainment today. Modern reality television, for example, often presents competitions that mimic the dynamics of the gladiatorial games. Contestants are pitted against each other in physical challenges, often under intense psychological pressure, for the entertainment of the viewing public. While these reality shows are far less violent than the gladiatorial games, they echo the same core elements: competition, spectacle, and the desire to see someone fight for victory. In many ways, the gladiatorial games have become an enduring symbol of human conflict. The way we engage with the struggle for recognition, survival, and power. The gladiators' battles in the arena were not just about physical combat, but about the philosophical questions surrounding life and death, freedom and subjugation, and honor and sacrifice. These questions continue to shape how we understand competition, suffering, and entertainment today.